So today we're going to be talking about a plant that probably is one of my best 5 sellers on our website, but also is a very common to grow aquarium plant in the hobby, as well as some of its relatives that are kind of similar and kind of not. So today we're going to be touching on Sagittaria as a species, but we're going to be touching on Dwarf Sag, Narrowleaf Sag, and Broadleaf Sag. So let's get into it. What's going on, guys? Justin from H2O Plants, and yes, today we're touching on Sagittaria. It is actually probably one of the most common species of plants available in the aquarium hobby. Pretty much every fish store that you go to will have some sort of variation of this plant, and many online sellers also sell this plant, and it's a very, very just common plant in general. You could also find it in the wild fairly easy. So in this bucket in front of me, I actually have 3 different species that I wanted to show you today. Those are Dwarf Sag, or Sagittaria sublata, Narrowleaf Sag, which actually technically has a similar nomenclature to its name, and Broadleaf Sag, which is fairly different. Now, there are other types of Sagittaria out there. These are just 3 that we particularly have in stock all the time usually. They're a very common plant, so it's easy to get them through our distributors and whatnot. But there's some confusion with Dwarf Sag and actually Narrowleaf Sag, so I want to kind of break those down and show you the differences, as well as also show off Broadleaf Sag. Since we only carry these 3 specific Sages, it just makes sense to do all 3 in one video. So this is the common pot of Dwarf Sag here, and you can see here that its leaves are kind of big. They're maybe about 4 to 6 inches tall, and that's kind of normal for this plant. When you first get it, or at least when we first get it, it was grown above the water or in a highly humidified area, and so it has most of its leaves that were grown above the water, and it will transition down to be much smaller. Now, I have a pot here that's been sitting in our tank probably, I would say, almost for, I don't know, 5 or 6 months maybe even longer, and that's what it looks like. So it's very, very small, and it is very grass-like, so it's a very nice carpeting plant. Now, here's the thing, though. You have your regular Dwarf Sag, which, like I said, looks like this. And then you got Narrowleaf Sag, which looks like this. You can see the difference. This one's only somewhat taller, and they look almost identical. You wouldn't really know the difference if you weren't a plant nerd like myself or have experience with both species. If you saw this in a pet store and it said Dwarf Sag on it, you would think it's Dwarf Sag because it looks identical. And that's commonly the problem with it, is a lot of people buy this plant by accident thinking that it's Dwarf Sag. Sometimes it's labeled as such, even though it says on our tags Narrowleaf Sag. Sometimes they'll say Dwarf Sag on them. I've seen suppliers sell them as such, and they're actually Narrowleaf Sag. And you may say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, if you get this guy, the taller one, it's going to grow a foot tall. Usually it gets kind of big very quickly. So something that you would think would be a carpeting plant that you could put in your foreground of your tank, maybe in like a 10-gallon tank or 20-gallon, suddenly becomes a background plant for your aquarium. And, you know, that's kind of sucks because you intended to buy one plant and you wound up getting the other, and it happened. There's really not much that you could do about that. That's unfortunately sometimes just the trials of trying to get the right plant. We do sell them, like I said, on our website at the right kind of plant, so we don't, you know, substitute Narrowleaf Sag. But I have seen in the past some of our distributors that actually made the mistake, because when I got the plant and it looked way bigger than it should be, and normally it shouldn't be that big. Now, Dwarf Sag as its own plant can get a little bit taller than what we have in this little pot here. This isn't obviously its like final size. It can get relatively bigger, but I wouldn't say anything more than about 4 to 6 inches at its max. Now, let's say it does grow taller than what you'd prefer. Maybe you want it down to like 2 inches. Well, when people go to trim, and either one of these plants really, like if you go to trim this with your scissors and you go like this and you give it a nice haircut, what you're actually doing is you're damaging all the leaves that you just cut, because these plants aren't stem plants, they're a rosette plant, which means that all the leaves come out of a center point in the soil, or at their root mass basically. And when you trim that leaf, you've just damaged it, and it's no longer going to be as healthy as it could be. It may start to brown over time and eventually die off. Now, that's not to say that you're going to kill the plant by trimming it that way. I mean, if you want your scape to look a certain way, you have to do what you have to do. But just know that the existing leaves may die back and eventually brown. You'll eventually get newer leaves, smaller growth, because what happens when you cut a plant and just damage itself, it kind of like thinks, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't grow that way, so it's going to grow a bit differently. And sometimes it'll grow more compact, sometimes it'll grow more horizontal, Sometimes, depending on what you're doing, it could grow, vertically too. It really depends on the plant. But in this particular case, the more you trim it, the smaller and smaller it's going to get eventually. So that's always a kind of method to get plants smaller, just constantly having to trim. And I don't mean like once a month. I mean almost every week or 2 weeks, depending on how tall it gets. So if you chop it down to 2 inches, and then you want it to stay at 2 inches and it grows like an inch in a week, you have to actually continuously trim that down and keep it that way. So that way it gets the hint and stays smaller. Now, like I said, very easy plants to grow, both dwarf sedge and narrowleaf sedge, but let's talk about dwarf sedge for a second. If you want to carpet it out, it can grow without CO2. It can grow without high lighting. This particular plant is in a tank with about low CO2. I wouldn't say it's anything crazy. It's like one bubble every 5 seconds or so. So it's just a very small steady stream of CO2. And also the light on the tank would be considered about medium to high, and that's why it's probably growing more compact than it should be. Usually it would be more of a grass-like. This is kind of like a little hedge that's folding over maybe. So the reason why this guy is so small and compact, like I said, I've had it in one of our holding tanks for a while. It just sat in there because when we first got it in, I don't know if it got too cold or whatnot during shipping, but most of the leaves died back and it didn't look presentable to sell, so we wound up just keeping it, and that's why we have all this new underwater growth and it looking nice and small and compact. Normally, we ship out something that looks similar to this, that has some new growth on it, but not completely melted back of all of its immersed grown leaves and fully converted, so it's usually partially converted. Now, how does dwarf sedge propagate? Well, it's kind of pretty simple here. So I'm going to take actually this one out of the pot so I can show you guys. It's probably not going to have any babies in it right now. That's the plant right there, right? It has this little root ball down at the bottom here. And what this guy will do is eventually it'll send out a little runner in the substrate, and it's like a long piece of, it almost like resembles a root kind of, and it sends out this long runner, and then eventually it'll plop up maybe 6 inches away or so, and then all of a sudden you'll see new leaves pop up from that area. And that's a baby plant that comes off the mother plant once it gets to a certain like size of its mass or certain health. Once it feels that it's okay to reproduce, or sometimes when it feels endangered, it will reproduce as well. So that baby plant, once it kind of pops up and you see at least like 3 leaves, that's a new plant that you could snip off the runner, or you could just let it go and it'll continue producing more runners as it goes along the substrate, which is what you want when you want to carpet these guys. So pretty much when you get these, just plant them down, leave them be, and let them do their thing. They're going to carpet out eventually. And now it's the same sort of thing with narrowleaf sedge. It will produce runners along the substrate as well, but this is more of a background plant. It will grow, like I said, up to a foot high. Typically you won't see it that high though, that quickly, but once it does like start to get hold, it will grow rather fast. So it just takes a while to get going, and then eventually it'll start putting up new leaves daily almost. And the other sedge that we haven't touched on yet is the broadleaf sedge, and this one is this plant right here. This is the broadleaf sedge. Let's see if I can get a better close-up of it. You can see here, much bigger. The leaves are much broader. They're probably about 3 times the width of all the other leaves, and it's just a more robust plant. This is good for a mid-ground plant because it kind of, as you can see, its leaves fold over, so it wouldn't be ideal for like a height plant in the back or a foreground plant because it's just too big, but a mid-ground plant and has some nice accent features and looks pretty cool. Same things as the other ones, it will produce through runners, although it takes a very long time for this particular one. I've very rarely seen them produce runners in the time that I've had them, so it just takes a very long time. And sometimes if it does produce like a baby off the center root structure, so if you open this guy up, sometimes you could split them if there's like another pup that's inside where the root mass is. Sometimes there'll be like a side pup coming out. You can also break that off, and that would be a baby plant. But all in all, this is, if you compare the broadleaf to the narrowleaf, you can see clearly narrowleaf stands straight up pretty much and has much skinnier leaves. Broadleaf has much larger leaves. So as far as all 3 plants go, pretty easy. Low to medium light is pretty good, although if you want your dwarf sedge to carpet out faster, high light and CO2 will help them do that much quicker, but it's not neat. pH anywhere between 6 and about 7.5. You could try and push it to 8. Normally anywhere between 6.5 and 8 for most plants is good. Very rarely will they actually have a hard time, but in some cases it can. As far as temperatures, 65 to about 78 is just fine. You can push that to 80 if you want to try it. I keep mine in about 70. And because these guys are a rosette plant, having a good substrate, or at least like root tabs or something, will definitely help them definitely put in something that they can eat at the roots. They will like that very much. And that's about it. That's the difference between all three sedges. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, leave me a like down below. Let me know your experience with Dwarf Sedge, Broadleaf Sedge, or Narrowleaf Sedge, if you've had experience with them, or if you're thinking about getting any of them after watching this video. If you're new here and you want to catch more aquarium plant videos or more plant videos in general, make sure you click that subscribe button or the round button on the screen. If you want to check out our last video having to do with Bacopa, which is a super awesome plant, stem plant, and very healthy actually, you can click over there. If you want to check out a video on the Epongeton bovinianus, which is a nice large plant, you can click over there. I will see you guys next time.